Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well this evening. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well and I am Eve Engler. Canadian Foreign Policy Hour is a critical look at Canada's role in the world. And I'm coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. I'm seeing things a little bit odd, so I hope I'm spotlighted for everyone. So yeah, the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, I think it's like the 112th session, weekly session. And it's just basically a critical summary of Canada's role in the world. And this week there are many developments that are worth touching on. First of all, there's significant drought leading to acute hunger, according to a New York Times headline, in Southern Africa, in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and apparently millions are facing hunger. And the story says it's hard to link it one-to-one, of course, to climate change, but there's increasing drought that is coming from climate change. So there's a link there. There was a piece in the Journal de Montréal that I noticed on the climate crisis that's I think worth mentioning. In the piece, they say that Canada's responsible for only 1.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore, you hear this one commonly, where therefore not much we can do about climate change. And this piece, what it added to it was that it says that Quebec is responsible for, according to this piece, 11.6% of the Canadian emissions. So Canada's only responsible for 1.5. Quebec's only responsible for around 12% of Canada's, and therefore what Quebec does is totally irrelevant. Was essentially the point of the piece. Now, by this logic, of course, basically what any country does doesn't matter, and what anybody, individual, city, by this logic could just ignore it all. But what I find most important is that the people cite the 1.5% of Canada's global responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions, but Canada is less than 0.5% of the world's population. So the lack of internationalist perspective on this, and I have to say, I blame the environmental movement in part for this, because they very rarely cite Canadians' outsized per capita emissions and bring in a global perspective, pointing out that Canada's dozens of times more per capita than many African countries. That you leave yourself vulnerable to this type of criticism that Canada is responsible for very little. So now, of course, Quebecers are above the average per capita globally. They may be below the average per capita within Canada, but they are above the average per capita greenhouse gas emitters globally, and that's something that needs to be understood. In Ecuador, there was a referendum, a number of referendum questions. I think it was on Sunday. I think it was yesterday, maybe it was Saturday. And the referendum, one of them, they voted against changing the constitution around investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. Apparently, back in 2008, the Constitution passed something that essentially outlawed the investor-state dispute mechanism, which is essentially giving corporations the ability to sue local governments in an international tribunal. And the Canadian government in recent months has been pushing with the current right-wing government to have a free trade agreement that includes ISDS in it. And so this referendum was a rejection of the Canadian government's push on that front. Now, The Canadian government's push on that front, of course, is all about Canadian mining companies that are major players, dominant players in Ecuador. I believe Canada is either the biggest or one of the biggest investors, Canadian companies in the country. And Owen Schock has a good piece on the Maple titled "Canada Pushes for More Mining in Ecuador Despite Resistance." And it talks about the opposition to a Canadian mining company in recent months. Mining Watch posted about how it joined 8 international organizations that just sent a letter to the Canadian ambassador to express their criticism of the escalating violence and conflict with the Canadian company Solaris Resources in Ecuador. And so in this piece that Owen Schock published that goes into Canada pushing the Ecuadorian president was in at the Mining Association of Canada meeting in early March in Toronto, and he met with Trudeau and then pushing this sort of mining policy. He points out, as I think I've mentioned in previous sessions, that whenever there's repression in Ecuador in recent years, when there's repression against anti-neoliberal, which is very tied into anti-mining, the indigenous movement, powerful indigenous movement that's critical of mining, the Canadian government's always quiet about the repression in Ecuador. And so in the piece, Owen Schock quotes Stuart True from the Canadian Centre for Policy and Alternatives, saying that Canada is the 12th biggest economy in the world, but we're the 4th most litigious country when it comes to companies using ISDS to challenge environmental decisions in other countries, challenges with respect to mining permits and whatnot. So Canadian companies are big players in using the ISDS, the investor state dispute settlement systems, which obviously we know why, because Canada is a major mining powerhouse. And so Canadian mining companies have repeatedly employed this mechanism to advance their interests. This is not just about Ecuador, but more broadly. And obviously, as they're pushing for this in a new trade agreement with Ecuador, that becomes relevant. There was a international UN body article about delegates at UN take aim at Canadian government and mining companies. So a big indigenous conference, UN conference, and they explicitly criticize Canada's role, the federal government and Canadian companies' role in pushing mining around the world. The Globe, about a week ago, the business section had a story. They mentioned that the AFRICOM, the publication of the U.S. AFRICOM, the U.S. Military Command in Africa, that it's called Africa Defense Forum, which is their publication, explicitly talks about a Barrick gold mine in Mali, and it says that it's, quote, in Russia's crosshairs. So the publication of AFRICOM, the U.S. Military Command in Africa, is saying that Barrick's operation is basically concerned about Barrick's operation in Mali because the Russians have it in their crosshairs, according to them, which I think is interesting on a whole bunch of levels. I think it speaks to the fact that U.S. AFRICOM sees Canadian mining companies as not much different than American mining companies, which is actually pretty correct. If you look at Barrick Gold's board, previously actually had George H.W. Bush was on, George Bush Sr. was on the board, and there's been other prominent American sort of political officials, and probably a significant chunk of the capital is probably American capitalists. Also, I think what's interesting about this is it just speaks to the degree to which they see Russia as a threat, right? There's the degree to which now increasingly everywhere around the world, the U.S. is seeing Russia as this threat, and there is this sort of whatever you want to call it, Cold War, not so Cold War, depending on where we're talking about in the world, with Russia. And so barracks operations get viewed by the U.S. within that light. On the question of the proxy war, I think the situation is actually getting worse. We're getting, the media attention has subsided. There's been media attention in recent weeks, I guess, to the extent there has been attention, is about how Ukraine's position is weakening and worsening, and all kinds of stories coming out about just how hard it is to get men into the military and how many people are fleeing the border. And one story about them crossing this water, I think, with Romania, at the border with Romania, and it's people, I think a couple dozen people have died trying to escape the country to avoid being conscripted into the military. So that's happening, but also there's escalation, right? There's an escalation going on here where Ukraine is going deeper into Russia, and Russia is also blowing up more and more stuff in Ukraine. And obviously over the weekend, the U.S. Congress passed this massive bill to put more than $60 billion in new, principally weapons, into Ukraine, and the likelihood of that is that it's really just going to prolong, right, a situation that is very unlikely that Ukraine can win, and intensify, right? That's the situation, and there's more and more stories coming about getting European troops, because now, especially with this American aid armament package, the Ukraine's problem is going to increasingly become soldiers, and there's just been so many who've died. There's so many who've been injured, and the people who want to fight, or that's their disposition, they've all joined the military already, and others don't want to do that. And so this whole talk about European countries joining is increasing, and there are we know there are NATO forces in Ukraine, but in a little bit more covert kind of manner. In the federal government budget, they say that, quote, Canada believes that now is the time to use these resources actively to support Ukraine in its existential fight. It is Canada's position that these assets can be redirected to benefit Ukraine, consistent with international law. So the Canadian government's budget says explicitly that Russian assets, the around just under 300 billion that have been seized, should be given over to Ukraine. That, of course, is a big escalation, and that has pretty significant potential ramifications on the whole sort of trust in property relations that capitalists usually care a lot about. So we'll see where that goes. In another form of escalation, Heather McPherson, the NDP foreign affairs critic, is sponsoring a petition to add Russia to the state sponsors of terrorism, which is a big step towards completely breaking off relations, making it very difficult to wind back from this position of hostility with Russia. And I believe only Iran and Syria are listed. And the Iran listing, that was a big obstacle to the Trudeau government, which initially said they were going to restart diplomatic relations with Iran. The Harper government having listed Iran really made it difficult for the Trudeau government to restart diplomatic relations. And so that would be a big escalation. It probably won't happen, but the fact that the NDP foreign affairs critic, 26 months into this horrible war, that her position is basically, Heather McPherson's position is just double down, more belligerence, more rather than the alternative, which is, it's not an easy one, and I'm not saying it may not even be possible right now, but which is diplomacy, which is negotiations, which is trying to find some way out of a forever war. And that's the path that we're on, is just keep going for longer and longer. Realistically, Ukraine's probably going to lose more and more territory the longer this goes on. And certainly there's going to be more and more Ukrainian soldiers killed, not to mention Russians, but probably principally Ukrainians, and Ukrainian civilians. But we're in a state where even the opposition in Canada is still saying more of this kind of direction. The Globe and Mail had a piece about the donations by these former SS and in the name of former SS and Nazi collaborators to the University of Alberta. That came out, with the Hunka Gate in Parliament back. I guess that was in September, maybe, and the amount of money, it was, I think, something like $1 million. Basically, the point is that at the time, University of Alberta said they were going to investigate the matter, and now here we are 6, 7, 8 months later, and they've basically just tried to ignore the issue, hope it goes away, keep the money that's been raised, not really move on getting rid of these scholarships or these different, commemorations that the university has towards individuals who fought with the Nazis. On the note of kind of diplomacy and that whole question, Hill Times points out that the budget, the headline of the story is "Defense over Diplomacy Spotlighted in Liberal Budget," with a modest initial spending on foreign service reform. So basically, there's a bunch of new money for the military, and that there isn't for Global Affairs Canada. And they point out that Global Affairs budget is actually in line to drop. So it's about 8.8 billion. It's going to go down in 2025 to 8.1, and apparently it's going to go down to 7.4 in 2026. So that's less than the military is over 30. So it's less than it's about a quarter of the military budget, which is, it's always important to keep in perspective. Even the aid budget's less than a quarter of the military, around a quarter of the military budget as well. On the foreign inquiry front, there's, I think, an increasingly openness. I may have talked about this last week, but clearly there is a faction of the Canadian media, at least, and maybe the politicians, but certainly in the media, that basically want the intelligence agencies to run government, right? And there's this sort of how dare the Trudeau government not have just listen to whatever CISA said about that liberal candidate Han Dong or that issue, and so there is this element of the you could call it kind of like the deep state in Canada. This would be, if there is a deep state, it would be CSIS, Communications Security Establishment, global affairs in a sort of slightly different sense. Just continue running foreign policy or running policy more generally. And so we've seen some of that come up in this whole foreign interference inquiry. There's a piece in the Montreal Gazette from this former CSIS analyst that's really quite clear about it. And the framing is Ottawa must get serious about foreign meddling. So getting serious about foreign meddling is essentially letting CSIS, CSE determine Canadian foreign policy, determine, to some extent, Canadian government policy more generally. And in the federal budget, there's an extra $650 million for CSIS. I think it's over 5 years, basically to enhance its Toronto operations, which the Toronto operations are considered sort of like the main hub of challenging foreign interference, because the Chinese consulate via Toronto has been considered a major interferer in Canadian affairs. So the beneficiary, not by chance here, a major beneficiary of all this whole brouhaha about foreign interference is going to be CSIS, which has been driving the boat on this whole question. So on the Iran question, kind of in a maybe similar in some ways with the media wanting the intelligence agencies to run Canadian foreign policy, there's this whole, they're hawkish, right, on the Iran question, right? They're criticizing Melanie Joly on Iran. One piece in the National Post we published in the Gazette and elsewhere, Israel must ignore the likes of Melanie Joly and rally to fight against Iran. Another one was Iran's act of war proves justification for targeting the country's nuclear program. Okay, this is, fortunately, thus far, it looks like reason has prevailed on Netanyahu. Okay, and he went with a more minimal response to Iran's response to blowing up the diplomatic compound in Damascus. So that's good, and I'm not inclined to credit Netanyahu with much, but I'll credit him, within that box. That's better than going into something that would escalate it further. And apparently, a New York Times piece is saying that there was a whole plan for a much bigger attack, and the pressure from the U.S. and Britain and elsewhere has kind of reined Netanyahu in, and I basically think that makes sense. That's believable to me. Still, when you look at like the double standards, the hypocrisy, which we pointed out in recent sessions on Canada's response. So Joly, after Israel struck Iran a couple of days ago, said, "I join my G7 colleagues in urging all parties to work to prevent further escalation." Of course, when Iran hit Israel, it was, "We unequivocally condemn Iran's attack against Israel." So that distinction. On the whole question of Iran, there's lots of dangerous elements to this. Iran has basically responded to the Israeli threats by saying that they would potentially move forward with their nuclear arm plan, right? Nuclear weapon plan. That Iran has thus far, despite all of the claims of the Israelis and whatever, has chosen not to do that. And if the more aggressive Israel is, that would be a logical response from Tehran's perspective to push forward with that, believing that if they had a nuclear weapon, Israel would be more cautious in its aggressiveness. I don't know if that's true. It may be true. It's a horrible reality if it is true, because if Iran goes nuclear, there's a very good chance Saudi Arabia will try that, and proliferation is just not what we need. Of course, what we need is a nuclear-free Middle East, but that would force U.S. nuclear-armed submarines, and more importantly, Israel to change directions. With regards to Iran, there's always talk about more Canadian sanctioning the IRCG, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. There's this just sort of, we got to hit more pressure on Iran. Now, I don't want to go into a lot of the history of this because we've talked about, but we have to look at, Canada doesn't have diplomatic relations with Iran. Canada backed the coup against Mossadegh, right, in 1953. Canada then worked with the Shah, and while the SAVAK, the intelligence police force, was repressing the population through the 1970s, Canada was selling large amounts of weapons. And right until before the Iranian Revolution, Canadian officials were going there and signing business agreements, and it was all like, hunky-dory kind of politics. So Canada's moral standing on this whole question is questionable, and I think some of that history needs to be brought into these discussions of further demonizing Iran, further sanctioning Iran, further trying to marginalize Iran from international affairs that the Canadian government is engaged in. The Montreal Gazette today has a piece about a demonstration from some group from the Iranian community in Montreal, basically, calling on the Canadian government to sanction the Revolutionary Guard Corps, calling on Canada to get tougher with Iran. And in the piece, the spokesperson says, quote, "The majority of people with brains in their head don't have any problem with Israel. We are a peace-loving people." So basically saying it's just the regime in Tehran that has problems with Israel. It's not the Iranian people. That proves that this person, opponent to the government, is not connected to Iranians, and I don't even believe connected to Iranian Canadians. Obviously, among Iranian Canadians, opposition to the genocide would be, more Israel's genocide in Gaza would be more, be less clear cut than within Iran. But within Iran, I have no doubt that the vast majority of the population, people who do not like the government, do not like what Israel is doing, and a step further, would have a fair bit of sympathy for the Iranian government's reaction, to the extent that the Iranian government is engaged in pushing back against Israel. And it isn't as much as people frame it as, but it is more than most other governments in the region. They would be quite sympathetic towards that. And I think that's just the reality, right? Because people in Iran, even if they believe the media is biased and state controlled, they see through, and the fact that the facts are the facts, where it's what Israel is doing, not just recently, but the long history, and people would be familiar with that. So when Iranian Canadians are going to the Montreal Gazette and saying that it's only people with no brains that have a problem with Israel, they are reflecting the fact that they are disconnected from Iranians and Iranian Canadians even, and for that matter, basic morals. So on the Palestine front, there's been a number of developments. There was a Canadian aid group who had their truck blown up by Israel a few days ago, and they say it's a targeted attack, and pretty muted response from the federal government. I don't know if there's any response from the federal government. Yesterday or Saturday, I believe it was, in Ottawa, there was a demonstration, and at that demonstration, there was somebody on the microphone that said something to the effect of resistance is justified, and then said something to the effect of October 7th demonstrates that Palestine is moving towards freedom. And I would basically characterize it as a vague support for Hamas's breaking from the Gaza prison on October 7th. Not nothing strong or particularly clear cut, but a vague support for what Hamas did. And you got the prime minister condemning it. You have opposition, Mark Miller. You have Anita Anand. I don't know if all the ministers, I don't know if all the liberal ministers did it, but at least three of them that I saw condemn this, calling it abhorrent. It's abhorrent, this statement that was relayed. I personally don't have any problem with the statement. I think that breaking from the Gaza cage on October 7th was a act of resistance. Obviously, there were crimes committed within that. Most of the babies put in ovens and rape stuff is bogus. It's just part of the Zionist propaganda to justify the Holocaust in Gaza. But there was almost certain, well, not certain, there were certainly civilians killed. There were certainly significant human rights violations, war crimes that took place on October 7th. But at a macro level, It was principally a very successful targeting of Israeli military outposts and capturing of Israeli soldiers and the like. But yet, here we are 7 months later, and politicians are saying it's abhorrent. You know, they never say it's abhorrent what Israel's doing. It wasn't abhorrent when Israel even killed the former Canadian soldier in the aid convoy with 6 others. But it's abhorrent what this protest in Ottawa, somebody on the megaphone said. And so this is part of the situation in the incredible double standards. A judge here in Montreal gave a temporary injunction barring a number of groups, Palestine groups, from protesting within 50 meters of nearly 24 Jewish community buildings in Montreal. So they extended this. So initially it was just these 2, a synagogue that had hosted the real estate fair, and the Jewish Community Center that hosted 3 Israeli soldiers after Concordia canceled the event, and it was put at this Jewish Community Center. And in both cases, there were significant demonstrations. That was initially what the injunction was. And then somehow I missed this, but at some point they were able to extend it to many more Jewish organizations, offices, whatever. And now they've been able to get extended for 6 months. Apparently, Independent Jewish Voices, which one of the 3 or 4 groups cited that are not allowed to hold protests in front of these in front of these institutions. I think Palestinian Youth Movement, Montreal for Palestine are the 2 others, and there's a couple of individuals, I believe. And apparently, the judge has agreed to some sort of half thing with IJV, where IJV can hold protests, but it has to be a distance of 25 meters from the sidewalk in front of the buildings. So I don't. This is all totally absurd. If any organization is going to host IDF soldiers, they definitely should be protest. If any organization, institution, be it a synagogue or whatever, is hosting a real estate fair for Israel, not to mention West Bank illegal colonies, they should be protested. And it's totally outrageous that they've been able to get this this restriction on this. And I'll go one step further. Even if Federation CJA wasn't hosting IDF soldiers or a real estate fair, there should be a picket every day in front of. I think it would be totally legitimate to have a weekly picket in front of Federation CJA for having a walk with Israel everywhere, for being the sponsor of the Center for Israel Jewish Affairs, for fundraising tens of millions of dollars for projects in Israel. That is an absolutely, completely legitimate protest. That it's the real outrage is that no one's doing that. That's the real outrage. It's not that someone protested in front of the Federation building when there was IDF soldiers having an event celebrating genocide. It's that's not taking place on a regular basis. That's the real outrage. But they've been able to use the legal system to curtail that. There's a story on the Canada Files about the contrasting the education minister in Ontario condemnation of bringing politics into the classroom when the Peel School Board, a suburb of Toronto, that they have they adopted Nakba Remembrance Day. On their calendar, they have like a list of like 20 plus different sort of cultural, historical kind of remembrance type days, whatever. And they adopted Nakba Remembrance Day, and there's a big pushback from different Jewish and pro-Zionist organizations. And but Leachy, the Ontario Education Minister, was pushing Holodomor Day, right? And the Holodomor Day, the famine in the early 1930s, which has been morphed. I mean, it was terrible famine, but it's been morphed into a basically apologia for a certain type of Ukrainian nationalism that was aligned with the Nazis during World War II. So pointing out this real double standard in the federal government budget. Apparently, the budget for Deborah Lyons, the special envoy on protecting Israel from criticism, that the special envoy budget was doubled. And Deborah Lyons, of course, has been going all around saying all protests against the genocide are anti-Semitic, and she's just been basically a government-funded special envoy position to enable the Holocaust in Gaza. But it's just one of the pieces in this whole like edifice of crying anti-Semitism to justify slaughtering Palestinian children. There's a front page piece in the National Post on Tuesday or Wednesday saying, Ottawa told of critical need for anti-Semitism summit. So there was an anti-Semitism summit like 3 years ago that is part of what instigated the special envoy position that initially, of course, was Erwin Kotler. I mentioned this last week. There's a big full-page ad taken out by a bunch of Jewish lawyers in the National Post titled J'accuse, an open letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. They published it again in the National Post, so it was another full-page ad. It's just over the top. Basically, Jews are going to have to leave Canada because people don't like genocide. That Howard Levitt in the Financial Post, who's supposed to be this lawyer writing for a business audience to how to keep your workers in check and how to fire them legally. That's what his column is supposed to be. Over the last 7 months, it's just basically become a column. Again, it's in the Financial Post. It's not in the main section of the paper. It's in the business section. And this one this week was Jewish community needs a little help from its friends. And it really has nothing to do with business and has nothing to do with legal. It's basically just we need to suppress these people who don't like genocide. Today, Anthony Housefather, the Liberal MP, tweeted out, as Passover begins, I would ask Canadians to reflect on the fact that yesterday our Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition both needed to issue statements about anti-Semitic demonstrations in our streets. The last 6 months were the worst in 300 years of Canadian Jewish history. Okay, the last 6 months are the worst 300 years of Canadian Jewish history. I would assume Mr. Housefather is aware of the boat that was turned away, taking Jewish refugees from the Nazis, where many later perished. I would also presume that Mr. Housefather is aware of the quotas at McGill, the fact that in the 20s and 30s, the fact that there was a racist land covenants that excluded Jews, Blacks, Asians, whatever, from owning usually exclusive properties, and that was allowed until the early 1950s. Obviously, there's social clubs, that elite social clubs where there was either informal or formal restrictions, and a host of other measures. If you go back, certainly if you look at the 300 years, I think the truth is that the history of anti-Semitism in Canada is not the history of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. It is, and it's not even that of the U.S. It's a something more, I think, connected to Britain and sort of a lesser version than the British, which is a lot better than some of the other countries that we sort of hear more about. So he's right in a sense that the 300-year history of Canadian Jewry is not some sort of terrible history, but the idea that he's making his claim. Now, in Canada today, Jews are overrepresented in positions of power, have above incomes, above wealth, higher levels of educational attainment, etc. There's only one widely used social indicator where Jews are overrepresented in a negative sense, as far as I know, which is hate crimes. And Jews are very clearly overrepresented by pretty significant margin, I'd say. I think it's B'nai B'rith exaggerates it, but significantly overrepresented. But in the other incarceration rates, other things like that, that's just not the case. But when we talk about the 6 months of the worst history of Canadian Jewry in 300 years, point me to one Jewish Canadian who's been fired for their support for genocide. Point me to one Jewish Canadian who's like lost their, I don't know, their house or their income or wealth or something, right? Like it just doesn't exist, right? So this is this business of making this claim. It's just so clearly outrageous, right? It's clearly outrageous on its own, but then when you actually delve into it, it's even more outrageous because obviously it's designed to justify this horrific policy in Gaza. That's clear. But beyond that, it's actually totally tied in with all this racism in Canada, right? It's deeply tied in. Anyone who goes on Twitter on this stuff, on like the connection between claiming anti-Semitism and calling for like deport all the protesters, which is just a naked like anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racism, right? Warren Kinsella, who not that long ago, Warren Kinsella was doing an event, 2017, he did an event with Desmond Cole and the executive director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, okay? Warren Kinsella, he's viewed as like anti-racist. I mean, he should never have been in 2017, probably never was, but he was viewed as an anti-racist by people in, in somewhat anti-kind of racist circles. Warren Kinsella, a week ago, publishes a piece in the Toronto Sun, which is all about how multiculturalism has failed, okay? And the reason multiculturalism has failed is because Canadians are protesting Canada's role in enabling genocide. And the final words of this column is, it's time to kick them out, okay? We should just deport. I mean, I guess I should be deported. I don't know. Anyone who's been doing this protest should be deported. I mean, it's really what it is like, deport the Arabs and Muslims, whatever. Now, there's so many elements to this column that's just totally outrageous and like stupid, right? So he gets a whole thing about the melting pot, okay, versus Canada multicultural, US melting pot. Well, what about the protests in the US? Is that because of the melting pot? So it's just stupid on that level. Then you get into the whole question of like, well, so this is some kind of weird stuff with, so but like, is Jewish support for Israel's genocide, is that multiculturalism? Is that like, Jewish Canadians not leaving aside their I don't know, connection to another land, and that being, why? So on one hand, he would say that the Jewish community is a sort of distinct marginalized group, but then he also kind of just implies they're all part of the white majority. That's kind of in there with this, whose multiculturalism are we criticizing? But it's just racist. The so much of the crying about anti-Semitism is not just justifying genocide in Gaza, but it's actually justifying racism against communities that are actually marginalized. Numerically, statistically, if you look through Arab and Muslim communities, you find that they have higher unemployment rates, they have lower education rates, they're criminalized by the higher incarceration rates, et cetera, right? So it's used to target those who are actually racialized in Canada. Now, there's a piece in Yes magazine about the Broadbent Institute, which is this NDP-aligned kind of think tank that had their Progress Summit not long ago in Ottawa. And basically they had a panel, one little panel off on the side about Palestine. And they brought in a liberal Zionist, who was one of the main speakers who got the most time. And the story sort of goes through it, and it's kind of sad. It's not surprising, but kind of sad that this is where, this sort of like leftish kind of think tank is at on this. And someone posted about, no, I think Nora Loretta posted about Margaret Atwood and Ukraine thing. And so I went on to Margaret Atwood's Twitter account, and I have not, Margaret Atwood, I went back to December. I didn't go all the way back over the past 7 months. Nothing about Palestine in last 4 or 5 months. And actually quite a bit about Ukraine. She isn't posting that much, but I don't know, 30 posts over the past 4 or 5 months, something like that. And probably 5 or 6 on Ukraine related stuff. So she's clearly into the NATO proxy war. Nothing about Palestine. And it just got going, reminding me about all these like sort of leftish figures like Jim Stanford, right? I think I may have talked about him before, but I've looked at his Twitter a few times. Nothing about Palestine. Nothing in all 6 months. Nothing. And so, I want to do, we talked about Maud Barlow, but there's all these figures on this sort of left liberal kind of figures who, nothing on Palestine and all this time. And it's like, imagine, during the Vietnam War, right? People, and there's mass protests, mass left forces, like for something like Jim Stanford, okay, union kind of guy, right? So there was the Volkswagen in Tennessee that just for the first time in the South, they voted to unionize, okay, and they voted by it's like 80%, really stunning. I believe there had been 2 failed previous unionization drives. This is completely speculative on my part. No, I have nothing, and never seen anyone mention this, or no data on this. I wouldn't be surprised if part of what happened, a contributor, it's a heavily Black workforce, that things like the genocide in Gaza and the tumult around that, the protests and the sort of revigoration of the left-wing thinking, the sort of discrediting of the system that's come around that in some way would have affected the vote at on this unionization job. I don't know. This is very speculative, but to me, it makes sense that if the left is more invigorated, right? If there's more protests, there's more people saying like, "Holy shit, this system is so rotten." They'll keep giving these 2,000-pound bombs as they slaughter babies in Gaza, particularly with a Black workforce in Tennessee. That gets into people's thinking, and it sort of. Anyway, so the point being here in that the left obviously has a collective self-interest in promoting a anti-systemic mobilization, whether it's just broad anti-systemic mobilization that's happening. I don't believe it is exactly a broad it's not an anti-capitalist struggle going on or anything like that. But there's elements of it that clearly are that. It clearly is anti-imperialist, and elements of it that are, broadening people's analysis and broadening people. So people like Jim Stanford or Maud Barlow, or these people who are supposed to be like, figures of the left, the fact that they haven't even, if you don't want to criticize Canada's role in the genocide, though obviously you should, and you should have not just done it once, you should have done it dozens of times, quite frankly, over the past 7 months. But just from the self-interested of like building the left, right, that this is, these are the type of forces that we want to unleash. We need to unleash popular mobilization. We need to unleash young, heavily racialized communities mobilizing, of course. And it's really ironic. There's groups that say that they all, they're all concerned about like, getting young people engaged and racialized people engaged, and then they have nothing to do with these, the biggest racialized protests in Canadian history, which is what the current protests are. Anyways. But there's a good piece in The Breach about the Palestine Solidarity, the network, Palestine Solidarity Network, I think they call them, Canadian Palestine Solidarity. I forget what they're called, but and it's about the House of Commons motion entitled "The People's Movement That Helped Force a Liberal Shift on Gaza Policy." Heather McPherson is presenting her parliamentary position for a 2-way arms embargo, and she's saying that's the 9th largest petition in Canadian parliamentary history. McGill, there was the hunger strikers who've been on for 60 days. 2 of them have been hospitalized for their long hunger strike, and a number of people are on. There's some degree of rotating hunger strike. Some people have been on, I think, I don't know exact dates, but like a week or whatever. And people have been on different amounts of time over the past 60 days. They had a press conference a few days ago. Administration's still refusing, but they're still going strong. There was a very good action, got lots of social media action at McGill of changing the names of different buildings at McGill to like Palestinian villages and Palestinian names. I'll show a video of this. I think oh man, I've gone on too long, but I'm going to share this video because I think it is worth doing. So this is the mother of a 13-year-old whose daughter was killed in Gaza or died in Gaza, depending on, in January. And she's been holding a daily picket. I think during the week. I went to the launch, one of the early ones, and I think she's doing it. It might be like from 10 to 2 every day or something. I think she's doing it daily or multiple times a week picket. She's been doing that for a couple of weeks in front of Mark Miller's office. And Mark Miller was speaking on Friday at the Montreal Council of Foreign Relations, and a number of people paid the $150 to get inside, including this mother. And this is a bit of what.
You have murdered my daughter in Gaza in January, and you have been ignoring my demands and calls directly and indirectly with no heart, with no mercy. I'm not gonna leave. This is a live video. No. It's time for him to listen. It's time for him to listen to me. Because no. Don't touch me. Don't touch me. No. You are a child killer. You have no mercy.
So that's of course very very sad, but a pretty intense political interruption. And she has her daughter wasn't actually killed in an Israeli airstrike, but had health issues and wasn't able to get her medicines and also I believe food issues that then led to her dying in January. And she also has a sister and I believe a number of her sister's kids that she's been trying to get into the country, and the refugee program is very dubious. But I think it got some media attention. It got social media action. In my opinion, it didn't get. There was three other people, or there's 2 or 3 other people that were inside as well, and they did interventions that were also quite good interventions that followed up on this. So that's a pretty powerful intervention. Also, I just wanted to say there was also the launch of the Quebec delegation for the Gaza Freedom Flotilla on, I think on Thursday they announced that, and that's happening. I believe it's leaving from Istanbul, and I believe there's a Canadian delegation as well. I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll make Laura a co-host, and if people have comments or questions, we can do that.
Hi, Eve. Okay, you go ahead, Emily. Let me first unmute you. Can you unmute Emily?
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the disappointment of people who have high profiles that we would assume on the left would be more vocal. And I think, sadly, I think what's lacking is they believe in liberal democracy and a mixed economy, and they do not have an analysis of a socialist alternative. And so therefore they don't make a profound connection between imperialism and capitalism. And, so that's where they're left, and they're afraid to declare, for whatever reason, intellectually or otherwise, to declare themselves as socialists, because that's the alternative to imperialism from my perspective. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay.
I agree with that, but I think I don't think that you can be a social democrat and not support genocide too, right? I agree with you that it does flow from a bigger ideological limitation. That would, or I would call it that, right? But I don't think that, that you can, again, you can be a social democrat and not support genocide.
Okay, go ahead, Yuri.
You sure you don't want to go first, Laura? I'm
Nope.
I'm okay to wait for a bit.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Well, Eve, I wanted to ask. Actually, I'm gonna save some questions about Africa for another time, but I wanted you to respond to this. Our wonderful trollish friend Stefan. He typed the following in an argument about Israel-Palestine. He said the following: Hamas knew that Israel would engage in a brutal reprisal affecting the Gazan population, and it's proceeded with the October 7th attacks anyways. Hamas is at least bad for the Palestinian people as Israel is. So I want you to respond to that. Do you think that given that there was all these popular protests against Netanyahu and his far right government, I'm just curious your response to all of that, because that's a interesting theory.
Well, I don't think that the protests against Netanyahu have much to do with Palestinian rights.
Exactly.
They have to do with internal kind of corruption and cultural issues within Israel and stuff like that. There's a pretty wide consensus among the Jewish political parties within Israel of supporting Zionism, but also of supporting expansion and killing Iranian scientists and bombing in Syria and maintaining its occupation of Syrian land and et cetera. So or the siege in Gaza, most immediate import to Hamas. I mean, did Hamas think there was going to be a response? Obviously, Hamas knew there was going to be a response. I think that my understanding of part of what happened in October 7th is that Hamas didn't believe that they could possibly be so successful. And they ended up being far more successful than they expected to be. And they didn't, the rave, they didn't know the rave was happening, right? And that even the rave wasn't even confirmed until the rave was extended 24 hours, and that was an okay given by the military, not a day or a couple of days before. So they it ended up being much more violent. It ended up being more gave the ammunition to the Israeli military and politicians to be even more brutal. I mean, I don't know what does Hamas do, right? They try the March of Return in 2018, 2019 of nonviolence, and what does Israel do? They just blow off people's kneecaps, and
Well, actually, let me just say the following. It's not Hamas that led the march.
Oh, yeah, it wasn't. Yeah.
That was just a broad Palestinian consensus.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is Hamas is just one element of the Palestinian people. You have various different Palestinian schools of thought. Some are Marxists, some are liberal Democrats, some are secularists, some are radical Islamists. But generally, the Palestinian consensus is one of two things: that resistance by any means necessary. And amongst the Palestinian civil society group and the diaspora, there's broad consensus that they want the democratic one-state solution, because that deals with the whole right of return policy. But the whole Hamas knew that Israel was going to be so brutal, and they did this to make themselves more popular. Well, there's many people saying, I don't know if the evidence is really there, that Netanyahu deliberately knew in advance that there was going to be an attack, and then deliberately allowed the attack to happen so that he could then rally the Israeli electorate behind him, since he is a far-right douchebag, and this gets people distracted from the corruption, which he does need to be punished for, and of course the social regressivism of his far-right coalition, who are both fiscally conservatives and
I'm not sure if there is evidence. I'm not
conservatives.
sure if there's evidence that Netanyahu knew this was coming and just wanted it to happen for his own political reasons. I think that there was lots of Israeli intelligence suggesting something was coming, and the higher ups dismissed it and whatever. I'm doubtful that Netanyahu, I think Netanyahu is going to fall after this, and so I'm a little doubtful that this is politically self-serving for Netanyahu, but that's possible. But I'm skeptical of that. But yeah, I think you can blame Palestinians for the fact that Israel's been killing Palestinians for a century, right? There's always a problem with whoever the Palestinian political leadership. There's always a problem, right? And that's been going on for a long time. And it's not Hamas. It didn't begin with Hamas. It began way before Hamas existed. And there's always going to be, that justification, right, that Israel is going to put forward. So it doesn't hold water for me, but it doesn't. Almost all of the world sees through it. Almost all of the world realizes that's ridiculous. That doesn't necessarily mean they're supporters of Hamas. I'm an atheist. So that's not. But the Palestinian political reality, and more specifically the reality of those in Gaza, is of extreme violence by the Israeli state, and that goes back, that most people in Gaza, let's not forget, are refugees from ethnic cleansing in 1947-48. Almost 2/3 of the population. They've been driven out of their homes. They have never, those people who crossed on October 7th, they had never been, probably most of them had never been in area that their families were driven out from, right? And they went on a suicidal, that's the other part. There was as many Palestinian fighters killed on October 7th as there were Israelis killed, right? And that doesn't hardly ever gets mentioned, but these are people who went on what was effectively a suicide mission, breaking free from the cage and making a statement about you can colonize us, you can kill us, but we're gonna resist. There's gonna be some punishment coming back the other way. And at that general level, I'm totally supportive. Killing people at a rave, that's that's clearly a war crime. But at the big picture level, yeah.
Yeah, and we don't know how many of them killed at the rave were by the Israeli forces, their bombs as well. And also not to forget that the Hamas was seeing itself being erased, the Palestinians, with the Abraham Accords, and then they were going to sign on with Saudi Arabia, and with Netanyahu's presentation in front of the UN, where they were completely erased from the map of Greater Israel. So, I think they saw all these things happening. Anyway, go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, my comment, nothing was likely to improve for the Palestinians with the warming of relations between Israel and some of the other Arab countries. So they were stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if anything, things would have gotten even worse than what they already are. So I think it was fitting that they did what they did, and not to look back and say, well, yeah, we shouldn't have. Well, I'm glad that they did, because that's really how the history of the working class of the world, anything that we've ever gained has been born in blood. So that's the way it is.
Well,
And as far as, yeah, so many of these people on the left, I think there's an awful lot of thinking on the part of these people that we look up to and think that they should be saying something about it. I think in a major sense, lots of them are busy endorsing the system for the way it is. So that has to change, and I think it will.
Yeah, and if there's a looking back, the looking back, of course, is saying, like, why didn't we do enough? Meaning people in Canada, people in the US, Britain, who have been enabling Israel to do what it's been doing in Gaza for many, or Palestine more generally, for many years. That's the looking back. If there's something, there's a blame to go around. That's the blame, is that why weren't the, so. But there's, of course, an inverse correlation between people who were working to end the siege of Gaza, working to end Israel's slaughter in Gaza in 2014 and 2009 and 2018 and and those who blame Hamas for all this. Let's look back. Let's look back correctly and say, yes, it was a big error on our part that we forced a situation where Hamas was pushed into a position of doing what it did. Yeah, I think that I don't think that, and then then all we had to just stop the killing now too, right? Like it's also not just get past what we're actually, as people, children are being killed like today, yesterday, right? The story of the another hospital. Right, it's already 270 plus bodies. I think there's 700 bodies. Not the Al Shifa one, at the Khan Yunis hospital. Another 700 bodies expected in a mass grave. I mean, this is beyond belief. And then we're not, like, the starvation and the children dying and children from malnutrition. That's like, we're not, like, that's happening in who knows how many. This is yeah, that's what we have to work to stop in the immediate. But
okay, Eve, I think I'll ask the last question. And believe me, it's so demoralizing down here when you realize my congresswoman, who's an African-American Democrat, voted for the 26 billion for Israel, just came back from a trip to Israel where she stood with Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's just so sick. My last one, there's no other questions, but I just wanted to ask you, when you say that Jewish Canadians are overrepresented as sort of victims of reported racism, but do you not think that might be partly due to different cultural groups having different attitudes about reporting what they perceive as racist incidents? I could imagine some groups might not have good experiences with the police and security sector and might just not be inclined. And what we've seen in the last 7 months, I'm sorry to say, is a vast amount of whining by Jewish Americans and Canadians about feeling unsafe because of protests. And so I would suspect they might be overrepresented, in part because they tend to report that stuff more.
Well, that's definitely true. I mean, B'nai B'rith, and there's a whole, like, organizational structure to help Jewish Canadians report any incident, and both to police, and then B'nai B'rith does their own, like, compiling. So that's no doubt true. And conversely, Indigenous Canadians are, who are victims of probably more hate crimes than Jewish Canadians. The organizational structure and the disempowerment and the fear of police and on and on and on, they would have a much greater inclination to not report. That's not what I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is that the Jewish population is about around 1% of Canadian population. B'nai B'rith would claim that it's like 35%, and the official statistics of the Toronto Police say it's something like 30% of all hate crimes are targeting Jews and something like that. That's not correct. I don't believe that those numbers of both the official numbers from the police and the B'nai B'rith numbers are both incorrect. But what is true is that Jews are, is it 10% of hate crimes targeting Jews? I don't know the exact number, and I don't think anyone knows, but it's certainly much higher than 1% of the population. So in that sense, Jews are overrepresented. If you did a proper analysis of all this, I don't know where you'd fall exactly, but I think I'm very comfortable to say that on that commonly used sociological indicator of oppression or racism, whatever, that the Jewish community is correct in saying that there is a problem.
Okay, I think that's it for questions, Eve. Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
everyone. Same place, same time next week.
Thank you.